Thank you, Bill. Thanks, everyone, and I want to give a big thank you to ACES for having me here today, and an extra big thank you to the speakers this morning, who I think set us all up to talk about transmission, which is primarily what I'm going to talk about today. And then a final thank you to Roger for taking care of the jokes for this afternoon, because I don't think there's going to be a lot of laughs in the next 45 minutes. So hopefully you got all that out. So as Bill said, I'm going to talk about how we're going to build all of this clean energy infrastructure. And first I want to give an overview of just what we're talking about, right? We heard this morning how much renewables are coming onto the grid, right? That it's very economically driven, but I think it's still important to get a sense of the scale. Here we go. I got to press harder. How'd I do? Great. So I've got a couple of studies to show you. This is a study from the Goldman School of Public Policy looking at getting to 90% clean electricity. So this isn't completely decarbonizing the economy. This is 90% clean electricity by 2035. And this is focusing on solar, wind, and battery storage. And this is a graph of the new capacity cumulative. So cumulative each year, the new capacity that needs to be added between now and 2035 to get to 90% clean electricity by 2035. And it just keeps building, right? I mean, that's a ton of new capacity in solar. The wind is at the bottom in the green, then the solar, and then the battery storage sort of starts coming on. As we heard this morning, right, battery storage not necessarily economical yet everywhere, but we're gonna see the economics of battery storage changing too, and the need for battery storage changing. And then here's a different study from Decarb America by 2050. So this is looking at full decarbonization by 2050. And this is an average annual build. So this isn't a cumulative capacity. Each of these is an annual build in these 5-year increments. And they present two different scenarios, which I think is important for us to think about here. One is a high renewables, high electrification scenario. And the other is high conservation, where there's a lot of assumptions that go into this model, but importantly, we're talking about land use here, right? We're talking about minimizing the impacts of all of this infrastructure and where it's going to go. And you'll see that that shifts some of the choices. So we're still seeing utility scale solar, but under high conservation, we have a lot more rooftop solar. Instead of onshore wind, we're seeing more offshore wind, or different locations for offshore wind. And I also want to be clear that these data points that I picked are focusing on renewable energy because those are going to be the keys for that land impact, for how we think about where it's all going to go. But all of these studies, in fact, if you look at the full reports, they break down, this one in particular does a nice breakdown of particular states and shows that you're still going to have an all of the above energy mix, and that each state is going to see a different energy mix in reaching that decarbonization by 2050. So you're going to see natural gas, you're going to see nuclear. So when I focus on renewables here, it's largely because we're talking about building that infrastructure out in the next 45 minutes. So that's why I've done that. And in order to connect all of this, as we heard this morning, we need transmission. Transmission is essential infrastructure for every decarbonization path. And in fact, when you look at the transmission required in these studies, it's 2 to 3 times more transmission capacity to decarbonize by 2050 than we have right now. That's a significant amount of transmission capacity that we need to add, and it's got to go somewhere. So let's look at where we are with transmission capacity. That's 200,000 gigawatt miles right now in the US. It's been very slowly building over the last, we've got 4 decades here, 5 decades. And in the next 3 decades, we basically have an inflection point, right? We've got to peak up very quickly to reach any number of net zero or decarbonization goals in the next 30 years. So that's a lot of new transmission that needs to go just about everywhere. This graph is from Princeton Net Zero America. Here I've cleaned out where all the solar and wind will go and just focused on the transmission lines. So here's where Princeton found out in 2020 that you need to put transmission. This is where MIT found out in 2020 that you need to put transmission. This is where NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, found that we needed to put transmission. I don't know if you can see it in the green, in 2016. So where do we put all this transmission really depends on what study you pick. And I'm looking at my slides and I realize I've got one more. The red line is where NREL says we need to put transmission. And one thing that I think is important but incredibly challenging, particularly for folks in this room and in your roles, is that I can share all this model data with you, but I think the most famous quote about models, right, is that all the models are wrong, but some of them are useful. And I think that's something to keep in mind when we think about this amount of clean energy infrastructure we have to build. One takeaway is we have no idea where we need to build the transmission. Another takeaway is you can build transmission anywhere, and it is going to provide value for getting renewables integrated into the grid, and quite frankly, for building a more resilient and reliable grid, right? And we heard those themes this morning, that sharing power is also a very important role of transmission, that we need to rethink transmission, and it's not this one-way path from generation to load, but there's a lot of opportunity to be thinking about how we share power and share our resources, which we're very rich with in the United States. So we got together with some folks last year with the Clean Air Task Force. So Niskanen Center and Clean Air Task Force teamed up on a workshop and talked to practitioners and regulators in the area about this exact question. How are we going to build all this clean energy infrastructure? And we put out a report that looks at very much from a policy space, right? We're two think tanks, so we looked very much at the policy space. This question of private enterprise to public initiative and where solutions currently fall and where they could fall. And we looked at electricity transmission for all the reasons you heard this morning and for what I just showed you in those graphs, because it's crucial to that energy infrastructure. And it's quite frankly a bottleneck to that energy infrastructure. Jim talked about interconnection of renewables this morning. The interconnection queue has 1,400 gigawatts of clean energy in it right now. 1,400 gigawatts of projects that want to, well, sorry, they're not all clean. 1,400 gigawatts of energy that wants to get on the grid. 1,000 of them are zero carbon energy sources, solar, wind, and battery storage for the most part. So we need to solve this problem of transmission, because transmission has to lead the generation. It's the only way to make that generation functional is to have an ability to get it around the grid and around the country. But it's really hard, right? This is a very difficult problem. And one of the reasons we went with transmission as the focus area, as I said, on the one hand, it's the bottleneck. We literally need it, but it's also one of the most complex in terms of regulation and oversight. We've got the Department of Energy that has a role in studies in establishing corridors that are transmission areas of national interest. We, of course, have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who has oversight into transmission planning. We have NERC that has broad oversight, as you heard this morning, but particularly focused on reliability and the reliability of the grid. Then we have the regulatory utility commissions, right? And that's actually where siting happens for the most part. Where the lines are decided to be built, and if they're decided to be built, falls down to the state or local level. And then I apologize, it was an unintentional slight to the folks in this room. There's plenty of other organizations and regulators that are working in this area that I haven't even included, right? These are just the national names that I've included, but it's really sort of up and down the board, the engagement that you need in order to get transmission built in the country. And that makes it very difficult to get complex projects through a complex process. This transition that we're experiencing is going to be very difficult for a number of reasons. We heard this morning, right, consumer demand for renewable energy. It's not just retail customers. We see industrial customers who are looking for more renewable energy in their portfolios. But I understand that regulators and co-ops, of course, have to balance that against rising costs, right? How do we think about meeting all of those interests at the same time? Transmission sounds really expensive, and individual projects are quite expensive. But when we look at what the models show us about the cost overall, transmission is only coming in at 10 to 15% of the cost of the energy transition. So I think that's important to keep in mind too, that individual projects are very costly, but what they enable for the grid is actually for the long-term benefit. We have geographic diversity of resources in the US. We have broadly available and cost-effective solar. We have multiple wind corridors. We have geothermal. We, of course, have multiple natural gas resources. But then we also have competing interests, right? I mean, this is a complex market with numerous different business models that have different ways of thinking about their existing infrastructure and where they want their future infrastructure to go. And then finally, There's this tension about the salience of reliability and resilience. So we've been experiencing this and talking about this for years now, right? For the past couple of years in particular, Winter Storm Uri, the wildfires in California, hurricanes, what has happened in Louisiana in the most recent hurricane. We see these extreme weather conditions happening. Jim Robo said this morning, I think it was 8 degrees, he said, 8 degrees colder in Texas than it had been in 100 years. I mean, that's extreme weather that I think he was right to tell his folks maybe is not going to be so extreme. We need to start thinking about what that could mean for Florida, what that could mean for other places. But there's also operational complications that happen with an interconnected grid. The more that we are sharing power, that changes, quite frankly, market dynamics on the highest level, and it also changes operational dynamics about how that power is getting dispatched, right? That question of putting more power electronics into the grid, and where does the locus of control happen, right? And where is the computer making the decisions? Where is human interaction? I mean, there's a lot of difficulties in how we think about this change in what we need in the grid. Just last summer, the New York Times highlighted this: more power lines versus rooftop solar panels, right? And this is a conversation that I'm sure you're having, or have had, or if not, I'm sure you will have it in the future. This question of utility scale versus local, macro grids versus microgrids. Why should we be building transmission and sending power or buying power from elsewhere when we can generate it here? What we generally find, both in models and in reality, is that the transmission still brings the cost down. Again, those projects seem expensive, but local is actually incredibly expensive, right? And that's just economies of scale, right? Anytime that you can broaden and diversify, you are able to get lower costs and more options. But these are not enemies of each other either, right? Which I think is one of the challenges in the discourse that we have, is that we do need more power lines and we do need more local power solutions. So we got together at this workshop back last April, and we're talking about how we think about policies, right? And so that's really what I wanted to focus on for the second half of the talk, is this policy question. Jim Robo said we've got to think about transmission differently. And this is sort of our presentation and our thoughts on ways to start thinking differently about this kind of infrastructure. You may be familiar, if you've been to transmission presentations in the past, folks say there's 3 Ps of transmission: planning, permitting, and paying. And we've added 5, which is too many. I mean, it's enough to fit on one hand, but it's a lot of Ps. I acknowledge it's a lot of Ps, but it's important why we broaden this out. So planning, permitting, and paying are things y'all are familiar with already. Planning, what do we need in the future? Where do we think the load is going to be? Where do we think the generation is going to be? What's going to be shifting? What does the system need? Permitting is all the way down to where exactly is it going to go, right? Now I've got an idea of 1,000 megawatts that I want to move, and I've got to figure out where that 200 feet of right-of-way is going to go, and whose land is it going to impact, right? And can I use existing rights-of-way, and what are my opportunities there? And then where do I need to get the rights of that land from? Can I get it from the landowners directly? Do I need approval from a local siting board, from a state siting board? And that's just the siting aspect, right? There's plenty of other permitting that needs to happen in order to get things built. And then paying, constant tension of costs, right? What are the benefits of a line, and how do you divvy up those benefits? Particularly when we think about long-term benefits like resilience, right? If this line is going to have resilience implications that are only coming up once every 10 years, how do you put that into a cost-benefit analysis, and how do you decide what proportion that beneficiary should pay? So those are the 3 traditional Ps. And then we added 2 more. And I want to start with participation, right? So participation finishes that puzzle in the middle, this P for participation. Participation's pretty challenging, as, again, I'm sure the folks in this room know. And here, participation is a really broad definition and broad umbrella. Because if you talk to planners, they'll say they engage stakeholders. And if you talk to folks on the permitting side, they're engaging stakeholders. And cost allocation is all about stakeholder engagement. But one of the challenges is that all of those stakeholders are often differently defined, right? And so you've got different folks coming in, different organizations, different levels coming in at different parts of the process. And when we think about the scale that we need to build, we want more trust, not less trust, right? We need more consistency in that communication. And so one of the ways that we need to think differently about how we build clean energy infrastructure is who is getting included when, right? And that brings us to the fifth P, which is process, right? That all of these things need to be considered as a single process, a single repeatable process. Anyone in the business industry knows that's the only way you get to scale, right? You have to have a process that you can repeat, that you can learn from, because that's how you get more efficient and drive your costs down. We don't have that in electricity transmission, right? Every single line is different. Every single line is unique because of all of that complex regulation and oversight. But if we can start thinking differently about viewing this as a process, that planning and permitting and paying are all part of the same conversation, and that participation needs to be throughout. And that participation, again, it isn't just landowners, right? We're talking about, when we think about RTOs, right, where do co-ops come into those conversations, right? Are you in all the parts of those conversations that you want to be part of? And how do you sort of raise your ability as a stakeholder to engage throughout these conversations? So this 5 Ps is sort of our first perspective on broadening this conversation around transmission and clean energy infrastructure broadly and how we get it built. And then we looked at what we have, right? So what do we have for processes now? And this is not for reading. I recognize that it is very small font, but I encourage you to download the report, and this is available online. But we spread it across private enterprise and public initiative, where we're looking at private investment and local investment versus something more consolidated and more, so there's really two spectrums here, the private, public, and then the distributed and local versus the federal. Right, so we have a mix of this right now. Our first pass at this graph was looking at the policies that are currently in place. And they're different everywhere, but we do have national and international reliability standards, which is arguably a bit private enterprise, right? Because it's a standard, but those private companies, or public companies as it were, individual companies and utilities get to determine how they're meeting those reliability standards, right? It's a standard setting, but implementation is done more at the local level. As you move more towards the public initiative, there's things like the Department of Energy identifying corridors of interest. So this was something that was created in the legislation about 13 years ago. It has since become defunct, and now in my final slides, I'll show you how it's been reinvigorated. But there's ability for more national scope in how we set those standards or talk about what we need in transmission. And then, there's things like NEPA permitting, right? So when you're on federal lands, that's a pretty public approach, right? It takes in a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different issues, on what we need for building this infrastructure. But this looks different. This instantiation looks different depending on where you are in the country. So we started with this, and then we added to it, going back to this morning's conversation about how we change how we think of transmission, where this is a suite of solutions about how we could think differently about transmission. So we've got some ideas here like a national transmission authority. I mean, that would require significant congressional action. But I think it's important to think about our options for thinking differently, so we know what we want to reject and we know what we want to pursue, and we understand what's possible and how we can implement it. So there's things right on this national scale, that's national transmission authorities, but there's also state level instantiations of this, right? So New Mexico has a renewable energy transmission authority. I believe Colorado is standing one up, or either recently has or is about to. There's also using more public lands, right? So using federal highways, using state highways, right? Are there different ways that we can use our existing infrastructure to get things built? But that includes bringing those state stakeholders in the planning process, in the paying process, not just when you need to get to the permitting and figuring out where the line's gonna go. On the other side, there's plenty of opportunity for private enterprise as well. Congress has been discussing for almost a year now the possibility of a transmission investment tax credit. So renewable energy has experienced tax credits for a number of years now, but transmission has never seen that, right? And so it changes the dynamics of who thinks about the benefit that can come from transmission and who's investing in transmission. And even going further, not just the tax credit, but is there an opportunity to make these tax credits a direct pay? And I don't want to get into the finances. I think folks in this room know the finances far better than I do. But different ways we think about the structure of these private enterprise, where again, I'm using the word private loosely, but private enterprise, local distributed solutions that can still be driven and supported by federal policy areas. So that was our overview, and we published this report in August. And thanks to this report, Congress passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill. That was a terrible joke. We had nothing to do with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but the good news is there were themes because this report was really working on capturing the state of the conversation and moving it forward. So there is some congressional effort that has happened in the energy space, and I think that's also important to remember. There was, the discussion this morning talked about how things do feel really divided and nothing is moving forward. Some things are moving forward. Some things are getting built. And so looking at what has moved forward and what that means about the opportunity to use what is now in the legislation and the dollars that are going to be available, but then also what that means about the state of the conversation, right? And what future conversations could look like, what future bipartisan packages could be. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA is its official name, it has a mostly federal authority, right? So the Department of Energy has an expanded data set that they can use to study transmission and where we need transmission and when we need transmission. So transmission studies at the Department of Energy and even at RTOs and ISOs often look fairly short term on that 5 to 10 year, and now that window has been expanded by Congress, and I'll get to what FERC is doing too on the next slide. So you can look broader and look at more issues, right? So you can look at current economic congestion, but then also future economic congestion, where we see the grid going and how do we stay ahead of it, because transmission has to lead, it can't lag like it's been doing for the past 10 years. There's also mechanisms for the Department of Energy to partner with developers. So this is a fascinating public-private partnership, right? Sort of right down the middle of that spectrum. It's the federal government has some resources to bear, but it's still a private company or utility or investor who is identifying, like, here's the need, right? And here's the opportunity, and how can we work together to get this done? That backstop siting authority that I lightly mentioned, and I can talk for an hour just on backstop siting and siting authority. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to ask me later. It reinvigorated that ability for FERC to have some authority over siting of transmission lines, right? Giving some federal role in siting of transmission. And then really importantly, it provides funding for smart grid and grid enhancing technologies. There's $65 billion of grid money in the IIJA. $65 billion. Now, again, transmission projects are expensive. That's not going to build you a lot of transmission, but it's going to build you some transmission. Particularly, the way it's structured, I think, is really important. That there's a couple of billion that the Department of Energy can invest in a line that's already being built. A lot of the chunk of that $65 billion is available for states and localities to be looking at smart grid and grid enhancing technology. Right, so most of the dollars are actually not transmission specific, but there's an opportunity to do some distribution, transmission, right, sort of at the edge of those, right? How we think about data, how we think about dynamic line rating, right? How we think about using our grid, how we think about integrating new technology. All of these often have cost considerations that make it very hard to implement. Now there's $65 billion out there, and some of them have very interesting opportunities where the state needs to apply for the money, but the utility needs to have the idea and implement the project, right? So going back to that participation and stakeholders and who's working together to go after this money and change the grid to make it stronger, more resilient, and more reliable for the shift that we see coming. So that's what Congress is up to, and then we've got FERC. So the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission primarily has authority over planning and reliability, a little bit of siting authority, as I mentioned. And they just issued a notice of proposed rulemaking. And there might be further notices later in the summer, but this notice looked at regional planning. regional planning and cost allocation. And it encouraged RTOs and ISOs, in fact, it requires RTOs and ISOs, to look at those longer planning horizons and multiple scenarios. And not every RTO and ISO needs this encouragement, right? There are plenty, in fact, I believe MISO is one of the leaders in this area in looking at multiple scenarios and understanding sort of long-term opportunities for where we need transmission and thinking differently about how we build transmission. It also requires a consideration of interconnection issues. So looking into those scenarios, we've got an interconnection queue that's at least 4 years backed up on average to get a project approved. And the NOPR says, you've got to look at where interconnection has failed, where you haven't been able to get a project or you've significantly delayed a project, and figure out if you can fold that into your transmission planning so you don't have those problems in the future, right? To be more proactive. In fact, an hour ago, the Department of Energy also announced that they're working on the interconnection issue, right? So this FERC planning, that's going to be a long-term solution. But the Department of Energy is doing stakeholder engagement across the spectrum of local up through the RTOs on short-term solutions to the interconnection issues. There's also the ability, the requirement in FERC to consider grid-enhancing technologies. So this is power flow. This is about how we use our existing infrastructure more efficiently so we don't always have to build new lines. And then the requirement to confer with states, which goes back to that participation, is when are we bringing different stakeholders into the process. So that's a very high-level overview of the challenges of transmission and some of the opportunities that we see coming down the pike. And the most important thing is where we go from here, is how we take this congressional action, this FERC NOPR, but then also what you're seeing on the ground in your co-ops and utilities and other partners for how you can be part of shaping and changing this conversation to get us built the clean infrastructure that we need. So now I've got lots of time left for questions. So I hope folks are ready. Or I've answered all of your questions, and you're going to go out and build transmission. Just do it. Oh, man. We've got a mic moving. All right.
So, Liza, we know okay. Liza, we understand that there's a lot of existing proposed projects that are being permitted or in the courts and somewhere in the process. How are those going to be impacted by this? Are they now disadvantaged with the $65 billion that's out there, or is there some mechanism, DOE, FERC, or somebody is going to take those projects, because those are the ones that, if you go by the old phrase, they're shovel ready, as opposed to other ones that may have to go through a lot of planning for routes and all that yet. How do those benefit, or are they actually detrimented by all this and going to be at a disadvantage?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. Thanks for it. And I'm happy to tell you that based on what I have heard and seen from agency officials and seen coming out of the discussions of how the IIJA is going to be implemented, that there's really a focus on both. So that $2 billion that I mentioned for the Department of Energy to invest and the ability for public-private partnerships, they just put out a request for information and a notice of intent that talks about how they plan on using that authority. This is through the Loan Programs Office. And there's two directions that they're pursuing. And one of them is short-term, is partnering financially or in permitting or in whatever ways projects need with projects that are going to be completed and online, transmission projects that are going to be online in the next 5 years. Jim Robo had a line that he built in 3 years, but that's not common, right? That's why he was talking about it this morning. So 5 years is projects that are already in the pipeline, right? Are arguably shovel-ready or could be shovel-ready. They just need a little help getting over that last hump. And so the Department of Energy has already indicated that they are focusing some of their effort and some of their dollars specifically on that, right? On getting projects permitted, on getting that financing over the hump. And then their second round will be on that longer term, which is also helpful for having activity, right? Is getting projects funded now through that money, and it's a revolving fund, so they can keep iterating on it as it gets paid back, so that they'll have both projects that they're funding now that they're moving forward, and then projects that they're working with those developers on new ideas and new innovation that maybe isn't ready because the IIJA was a wonderful surprise in many ways of 2021. When we think about interconnection and the efforts on interconnection, right? I mean, some of these, particularly things coming out of the FERC notice of proposed rulemaking, those are going to be longer term, but then the DOE is coming to partner in on some of those shorter term issues, and that's going to help projects that are currently stalled in the queue, right, to get that transmission built. And again, we're already seeing some activity coming out of some RTOs and ISOs that's moving this forward as well. And I can't speak to that as explicitly as some of our esteemed speakers today. But there's fortunately, I think, a very good balance that isn't going to be to the detriment of projects that are already under development. In fact, there's 22 projects ready to go. Americans for a Clean Energy Grid released a report last year on 22 transmission projects that just needed a little help getting over the hump, but were within 5 years or less of deployment if they could get that final financing and permitting done. And those projects alone would add 50% more clean energy capacity to the grid. So there's a great opportunity here. Yep.
How do you see getting past not in my backyard issues with siding, getting easements and what have you? We've had at our co-op, we've had quite a bit of issues with getting right of way, and how do you see getting past that with all this transmission that you're saying that we need?
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually one of the reasons that we came together with the Clean Air Task Force to write this report, because I think it's really easy in the policy space, particularly in DC, when you're separated from these conversations on the ground, to say, well, you just do it, right? You just take the land in eminent domain and build it. And that's A, incredibly hard to do, as you know, right? That's actually an involved process. And B, that's not a long-term successful process, right? For the scale that we need, this idea of like just barrel through and, give it to the federal government, to do the eminent domain or whatever is not, I don't think, a long-term successful solution for this scale that we need. So I think you raise a really good question. And there's a couple of tracks that I think are important to think about. One of them is when we think about reimagining transmission, that stakeholder process, when are folks hearing about it, right? If you're only hearing about it when there's a line that goes through your property, it can feel a little bit like an attack, right? And you're gonna fight it tooth and nail. So I think including communities and community organizations and local groups more in that discussion from the beginning about planning can also help identify land that maybe is not the literal most effective and least cost, but could actually get a line built, right? Can you find the landowners who will work with you? Now, I do think, I'm not naive in thinking that we're just gonna get consensus, right? So I do think there is going to be a necessary role for eminent domain, which currently exists, right? And currently is used. And I think we're going to have to continue to use that to a certain extent. But thinking differently about that remuneration, I think, is also important. So the way natural gas pipelines financially compensate versus transmission lines, I'm trying to learn more about this, but my understanding is that it's often quite different. Long-term lease payments instead of like a single payment for the land, right? You're using a small part of someone's land, but if it's significantly impacting, their farming or their land value, I think there's different ways to be thinking about the compensation for the landowner in the community. And then the final one is rethinking where we put things, right? Is rethinking that land. There's been a big kind of push in the think tank and policy space around existing rights of way. and not just transmission rights of way, which I wrote a paper on how you can take an existing corridor and convert it to high voltage direct current, and you get 3.5 times the power in the exact same land on the same towers and the same wires that you're already using, right? So there's technical solutions like that, but then there's also thinking about land differently, like those highway rights of way, like rail rights of way. So there's a line being built along an existing rail right of way connecting Iowa to Illinois. Does that sound right? My US map is failing me, but I believe it's Iowa to Illinois. So it requires thinking differently, and it's a different process to go through to cite those, right? You've got to bring in the Department of Transportation, or state or federal, right, depending on where you're citing. So it's not, it doesn't feel as direct, and it feels like it might be harder, but the goal is you create the process, right? The first folks are always going to have the hardest time, but then if you start creating that process, then it becomes a new way of thinking about where we're putting lines and how we're building lines and who we're partnering with. That you can iterate on and learn on and streamline.
Question from someone online. Can you provide more details on how to best handle the cost allocation across seams, such as PJM to MISO, MISO to SPP, et cetera?
I think I would be the chair of FERC if I had a clear answer to that question. But I do think one of the places that I think the NOPR fell short is that it lists a possibility of benefits and a possibility of how to measure those benefits, but it doesn't go so far as to say this is the list and this is what we should be using. And I completely respect that there's a lot of regional differences in market design, in resource availability, in needs for the grid, but a common vocabulary is sort of quite literally how cooperation has always happened. And I think that's a place where if FERC isn't going to push it forward, there's an opportunity for some of the RTO and ISO leaders to be leading in that, to help define what is that translation of your benefits to my benefits, or can we start using the same metric, and what does that mean for how we have these conversations about cost allocation? So there's been some clarity in the courts, and I'm not a lawyer either. I feel like half my presentation is telling you this is not my expertise. But there's been some clarification in the courts on beneficiaries and sort of the direct local beneficiaries versus the broader grid stability regional beneficiaries. So there's some clarity coming out of the courts on that, which I think can provide some benefit as well. But again, I wish FERC had gone further, but in the absence of that, I think there's a real opportunity for RTOs and ISOs to lead in this conversation or continue leading in this conversation. And potentially, FERC has floated the idea of an independent transmission monitor within RTOs and ISOs. They haven't proposed that in a final rule, but it's an idea they floated out there. And I think that's another role that independent monitors could do, is to be facilitating those conversations. I appreciate these questions because I recognize that these are really hard challenges, and I'm sorry that I can't answer all of the problems of transmission, but I do take heart in the activity that is happening, and the fact that we're even talking about transmission. You know, one of the challenges of transmission is that it's been forgotten infrastructure for so long, and it's always sort of been handled, but we have to think differently about transmission, right? We heard that this morning. We have to think differently about our grid, and I think there's a real opportunity for leaders at all levels of that regulatory oversight, build, and ownership process to be asking different questions, right? And to be thinking about those partnerships. And I know it's really easy to say and really hard to do, but looking at costs not on the 5-term, but on the 10 and 20-year term, right? And that least cost now doesn't mean least cost overall, right? And that transmission for me could be transmission for us. Again, I know these are easy to say and hard to implement, but I think it's really important to be thinking differently about how we've done things as usual and how we can shift the conversations and the way forward.
I have one quick question for you.
Sure, hit me.
So a lot of focus has been on the build out of the transmission. Mm-hmm. How can we use the existing transmission we have in a different way in terms of refinement in technology, those types of things that could increase the stability of the grid, those types of things?
Oh, sure. I love that question. So one of the things that you can do is convert to high voltage direct current. That's actually difficult and pricey, but happy to talk about that offline. But other sort of more practical and short-term solutions are power flow technologies, right? So there's some opportunity, obviously, to control power flow in the grid right now, but there's so much more opportunity to change grid topology dynamically. And they're honestly fairly least cost solutions compared to building a new transmission line, but there's different sort of access to capital, right? So it's different conversations with financiers, for example, and leadership on, if you're getting a return or what the benefits are, right? They're not necessarily as direct as we have more capacity. It's more about our ability to serve customers in a different way or meet reliability standards. So flexible alternating current transmission systems, right? They manage reactive power on the grid, right? So it doesn't technically increase your capacity, but it increases your ability to use your lines because you can manage congestion in a different way, right? If you need to get more power through an area, you can reroute it in different ways around your grid. There's also things like dynamic line rating, right? So all this requires more sensors on your grid, a lot more power electronics, and a lot more sensors on the grid, but gives you the ability to respond in real time or semi-real time to changing weather conditions, right? And not just having line rating based on seasonality, but actually having line rating based on what's going on at the time.
Would you skip back to the slides if you still can? The second one, when you had the overlay of the think tank projects, macro projects.
I love that one. I love that map.
Yeah, and I was curious about that one, so bring it up if you would.
Yeah, I might.
Is that
Can
too
someone
hard?
else help with that?
You're
I apparently do not have good grip strength. We're all learning this live, that I've got very weak thumbs.
And I'll just ask the question. It
Okay,
wasn't
sorry,
specific.
Mike.
So we saw a myriad of projects, some pretty disparate ones. Help me with, have you ranked them? Has anybody reconciled what the assumption differences are from A to B to C to D?
Yes, I don't have the memory of that ranking in my head, but I know there's this really fascinating technical group, the Energy Systems Integration Group, that has taken sort of all of these studies and put together a report on basically this discussion of a macro grid and comparing sort of what the studies say we need for transmission, what they're measuring for transmission. And I really like this group because I think someone also mentioned this morning that what we need on average is not the same as what operators actually realize we need in the grid day to day, right? And this is a group of very technical people who are trying to marry these model questions with these technical needs. So I don't have the ranking off the top of my head, but I know there's a great report out there by the Energy Systems Integration Group
I was just curious
that talks about it.
if you knew kind of what the best one was, if they were ranked, and what the differing assumptions were. But I guess the other question, again.
I'm going to stop. I'm going to give myself and others a seizure here.
The other thing is who's funding it. It's the natural suspicious person in me who's ever got the project kind of thing or is focused on the project. They finance somebody. But I was just genuinely curious because, again, we talk about land and cost and we throw zillions of dollars around that we really don't have to throw around. We know there's potential great returns on some of these projects, but I just, kind of reconciling in my mind even the projects to enhance what we've got technologically, that's not a cheap date either. So, like I said, I'm not being critical. I'm just kind of curious about, again, what's the logic, what's the cost, and what's the possibility and probability, all this stuff we're going to be talking about it 30 years from now.
So I can give you a short summary of these here. So the bottom one, that first one that was the Bear US, that was Princeton Net Zero America. And they had a really interesting sort of land up approach, right? That they figured out broadly, sort of some broad ideas around what kind of energy was going to be needed and where it was going to be needed, but then actually tried to figure out where land was available, right? And then informed their transmission based on least cost solutions around siting the generation and then getting the generation to load. Now, one of the challenges of that study is that they use existing corridors. So they assume that you can take an existing corridor and just add I'm trying to reduce my profanity up here, a lot, a lot of capacity to an existing corridor, which is like maybe technically not really feasible, right? There's sort of limits on what you can do with an existing piece of land, and certainly limits on how much wider you can get a right-of-way, depending on where the right-of-way is. So that's the Princeton Net Zero, which is the bottom one with the purple, and it's a little more spurry as a result, right? Where you're getting the generation kind of to an existing line and then making that existing line really high capacity. The orange lines are the MIT study, and this was a really structured study that I think, again, there's a lot of value in models, so I don't want to be too critical. Each of these studies sort of has their own limitations, to your point, Mike. So I don't want to be too critical of this approach, but it's specifically constrained state-level approaches versus certain multi-state approaches versus national approaches. And I don't need to tell anybody in this room that the lines of ownership of transmission and distribution and utility footprints don't always, or rarely even, respect those sort of boundaries. So that's a bit of a limitation, but one of their goals in that study was to sort of demonstrate that issue of scale and coordination, right? The coordination does make things cheaper. The green lines is the NOAA study. So this one's 2016. This one's a lot older because 2016 was forever ago now, right? And NOAA is such an interesting place for this to come out of, right? And so they were really looking at that atmospheric. It was very much a CO2-based study that kind of re-kicked off all these transmission conversations we're having. And it was solely looking at least cost solutions using existing technology of the day. So that solution is very different than we're seeing now, because even in 2016, technology was so different, right? Energy storage was nowhere near where it is today. Solar and wind were very different economically. Even what they propose, the green lines that they propose are all high voltage direct current lines, and they presume an older technology that has sort of less flexibility than the modern technology, which all new projects are pretty much using. So there's some limitations to that study. And then the red one out of NREL is actually HVDC only. So NREL was tasked with looking at what HVDC could do to the grid. So you ask a great question, and thank you for giving me this opportunity, because you're right, there are limitations to all of this, and I think really drives home that conclusion about almost all transmission is going to be good transmission, right? There's lots of different ways to think about it, and we shouldn't be constrained by any of these models, but rather think about the themes throughout them, about kind of technology and cost and integration, and what that means about getting to our goals faster and cheaper overall. Thank you all so much. Oh, do we have one more?
Yeah, I've got a question for you. Maybe it's corollary to the last question, but how do we make sure we build the right transmission? And by that I mean so much of our processes have been divorced over time. Being from Illinois, we're a deregulated state, and so there's an imaginary curtain between those that produce the power and those that have to serve the power. Whether it could be, for example, MISO to SPP and the seams issues. It could be the separation between the transmission planning process and the generation interconnection queue. Mm-hmm. Everywhere we look, it doesn't appear that the right hand knows what the left hand is doing. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, if you throw around $100 billion here and $100 billion there, we're talking real money.
Yeah.
And so the final thing is that we've seen a large push in recent years with respect to the generation fleet to greatly retire thermal units in favor of renewables. Mm-hmm. And so the models that we use for these studies, I think we should question, are they even accurate? And so, at the end of the day, load pays a lot of this. And so, being from a cooperative, my question is, how do we make sure that we're doing the right thing? I know that you've said any transmission is good transmission, and I appreciate that. But I think there is a challenge that we face, and that is how do we do this the right way?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll try to answer that briefly because I know I'm going over time here. And I say any transmission is good transmission, but I do think there's some transmission that's more valuable and more effective. And on the one hand, the most effective transmission is whatever you can get built. And on the other hand, if we can change the way we think and plan and build, then focusing on this inter-regional, and by regional I don't necessarily mean like inter-RTO or inter-ISO in the way that FERC does, but like crossing those boundaries, right? Crossing state boundaries, crossing co-op boundaries, crossing utility boundaries, right? This boundary crossing, high capacity transmission is part of that changing conversation and changing grid for the sharing. So that's my first answer is I think the best transmission is a transmission that enables more of that sharing. And in fact, the SEAM study that I showed, that those red lines from NREL, that's just one of the solutions they come up with. It started looking at the western and eastern interconnection and increasing the HVDC capacity in those seams. And even just increasing that has more than, I think it's 1.5 benefit cost ratio to building those. So there's a lot of different solutions out there, but they focus on sharing across seams, right, and thinking differently. And you raise a great point about generation retirements. I think we still have natural gas. We have natural gas plants being built. I don't think we're going to see that slow down anytime soon. That's really there's a number of important services they provide to the grid. We also see a lot of attempts to bring hydropower in, to build power, non-power dams in the US, to increase capacity of existing lines. And then, of course, partnering with our friends in the north to bring hydropower down from the north. There's a lot of opportunity to be bringing clean, firm power onto the grid there, which is a whole other barrier of boundaries to be thinking about crossing. But thanks for that question. Thank you all very much.